I'm Lisa Ramirez. I'm one of the founding partners of U.S. Immigration Law Group. We're a full-service immigration law firm handling everything from removal defense. We represent individuals in detention to family-based petitions, young adults applying for deferred action, and then employment-based visas applications for investors, entrepreneurs. We represent a lot of companies, I-9 compliance, basically everything and anything having to do with immigration law, but nothing else. So as a point of reference or background in terms of my own personal experience in this kind of falling upon immigration, I had graduated from law school, didn't intend to go into immigration. I really wanted to do international human rights and discovered that I would need to move. Didn't really want to relocate to London, New York, or DC, and so I got a fellowship and placed me at an organization right here in Orange County. So I started my career in the nonprofit world and working both on a policy side of this issue, but then also on the service side, representing individuals, asylum seekers primarily, victims of human trafficking, and that sort of thing. So I kind of have a very broad spectrum of experience when it comes to immigration. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about the executive order. I think it's the hot topic that we hear a lot about in the news, and people don't really understand what it is and what it isn't. There is an injunction in place, so it's very rare that I speak on a topic that is yet to be implemented. So some of this is kind of speculative because it hasn't actually gone into effect. And there's aspects, obviously, of the executive order that we don't know if it will actually come to fruition. So everything's kind of on hold right now. Nonetheless, assuming that everything goes forward, I think it's important for the community to know specifically how this could impact your local city and then specifically the U.S. workforce. So for companies and for businesses that may get approached by individuals with this new deferred action to kind of know how to handle it. This presentation that I have is actually quite lengthy, so I'm going to be rushing through the slides. I'm not going to be able to cover everything just in the interest of time. But just to kind of lay out the parameters of the... Oh, thank you. Oops, that was too far. Okay, so as a general overview, in terms of the executive actions, if I had to break it up into three main components, one of the components basically provides for additional border security resources. Another component provides improvement to the adjudication of family employment-based petitions. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what those provisions are. And then the big kind of area that I think gets all the attention is the aspect of the executive order that will allow an estimated approximately 4.5 to 5 million undocumented immigrants to receive work authorization and protection from deportation. Now, it's caused a lot of anxiety, I think, in the community when people think about 5 million people all of a sudden coming, from the shadows and getting legal status. In my professional opinion, I honestly don't anticipate all those that are actually eligible to apply. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think there's a lot of fear. There's people who are quite content kind of being in the shadow. They've got stable employment. And to take the risk of actually applying for this opportunity that could be taken away from them at any moment would jeopardize, their future and their security and their employment. So again, the estimates are 4.5 to 5 million. We'll actually see once it rolls out how many people actually apply. So the border security will create some additional task forces amongst the different agencies that are responsible for our border security. Another main component is some of you may be familiar with the Secures Community Program. Those are programs that the federal government has entered into MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding with local law enforcement and training them to enforce our federal immigration laws. And that's resulted in kind of a mixed bag of both positive and negative results. I think some of the agencies that have embraced that program have perhaps abused some of the authorities and or the intention, I would say, of the program, and has resulted in a lot of people being apprehended and removed, resulting in family separation, et cetera. What Department of Homeland Security will be doing is to create, instead of the Secure Communities Program, a priority enforcement program to work with local state authorities regarding detention and removal priorities. So there's already a memorandum that's been released in terms of what those priorities are going to be, and they're going to really focus their resources to ensure that those priorities are being followed. So rather than kind of casting wide nets, they're going to be very specific in making sure that individuals who are either repeat offenders, have serious felony convictions, will be apprehended and deported more quickly. I won't go into this, but in general, I would say that there's some changes for HighSkilled workers. For those of you that don't know, I'd say two main provisions of this part of the executive order that would be important to know is, if you don't know already, those people who are in the process, so employers who are trying to petition foreign workers because we don't have enough workers here in the U.S., and they're typically in the STEM field, so your science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Unfortunately, because of the way that the system is set up, both for the family side and the employment-based side, it's just create a tremendous amount of backlog. So even those that are following the rules and trying to go through the system and the process are waiting upwards of 20 years sometimes on the family-based side. On the employment-based side, it could be 7, 8, 9, or 10 years depending on what country they're from. So part of the executive order is going to help improve some of those systems and processes and allow them to go through the process a little bit more quickly. Now they have to be very careful because any provision that requires a change in the regulation requires congressional action. So it's going to be very limited in terms of how they're going to go about improving these processes and what specifically they're going to do. The other aspect is that it expands the employment opportunity for individuals on OPT. And OPT is optional practical training. It's for international students who essentially come here. And those specifically that are studying in the STEM fields will have an opportunity to extend their OPT time, meaning that they're going to be able to stay in the United States for a little bit longer and get some practical work experience. At that point, it's really up to the employer whether they have a need for this type of worker to decide to petition them or not on a longer-term basis. I won't go into foreign entrepreneurs. There's some provisions there. Again, talked a little bit about that. A minor point that is addressed in the executive order is for spouses who accompany an individual sponsored by employer. The way it stands right now, they've been unable to work. And this will be a significant change because we have professionals. Sometimes there's doctors, there's scientists, they're professionals, and they come here and they can't do anything. They can volunteer. And one of the things that is actually in the process of being implemented now is that the spouses of the accompanied H-1Bs, they're in H-4 status, would be allowed to work. I won't talk about that. We won't talk about that. There's going to be some improvement to worksite enforcement. And so this is kind of like the bittersweet, because I think what a lot of people hear and what we pick up in the media is that this is really a legalization opportunity. And in my opinion, it's actually balanced. There's a lot of enforcement provisions in the executive order, so not just in terms of our border security, but there's going to be a lot of changes in terms of worksite enforcement. And I think this is something that employers in general need to be aware of. So if you're a business owner, you kind of need to be aware, and they're going to be focusing, because there's going to be now an interagency working group that is going to basically join forces to ensure that federal labor, employment, immigration laws are being followed. So everything to do with discrimination, if there's inconsistent policies, we're going to be probably seeing an increase of enforcement in I-9 compliance and investigations and audits pertaining to I-9s. There'll be additional enforcement with regards to wage and hour laws. And then there's also some changes to some benefits, I guess, for individuals who have been victims of human trafficking and the classification or categories of individuals that may be able to qualify for a particular type of visa for certain victims. So we'll skip this. Other reforms. All of this. I'm just talking about the executive order, and I haven't even got to the big hot topic yet. But yeah, all of this. Yeah.
Any questions or after your talk?
I think we're going to have an opportunity for all. You can ask any of the panelists any questions you have. So just make a note of it, and then I'll be happy to answer any question you have. Yeah. So other changes I won't go into, changes to the courts, our immigration courts, our federal courts, administrative courts, and they're completely inundated, and there's some changes that are going to be made there in terms of being able to prioritize resources in the courts. Okay, so here's what I want to kind of I think is important for the community in general to know. So some of you may recall in June of 2012, deferred action, first of all, let me just explain, has always existed. It's not anything new, but it's very specific in terms of the categories of people who are eligible to apply. On June 15, 2012, President Obama made his first announcement in terms of extending deferred action to children who arrived to the United States under the age of 16. So deferred action is not legal status, okay? I want to be very clear. People think, oh, it's a step to a green card, they're getting citizenship, they're going to be voting. None of that is true. Deferred action is simply protection from deportation. That's all it is. It is deferring action, which means removing them from the United States, right, because they're not documented. So it's deferring removal. So deferred action simply gives the individual with this status employment authorization and protection from deportation. That's all it does, but it is significant. And it is significant for many reasons. One is individuals who are undocumented, once they get their work authorization, that gives them access to a Social Security card. Once they have the Social Security card, that gives them access to a driver's license. Now, a lot of you probably heard also about the AB 60, special driver's license, and that too has kind of been implemented with mixed reviews on both sides of the political spectrum, on both sides of the issue. And I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into the details about that, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. So it essentially allows these individuals who've been living here for a significant amount of time, many of who have been educated through our school systems, who have graduated. I mean, we represent some of the, smartest kids I know, valedictorians, high performers at their colleges and university, and then they're basically left with no employment opportunities. So what this basically allows is individuals in deferred action can get work authorization. So that's been in effect for young adults. So if you were under the age of 31, you arrived to the United States before the age of 16, you can demonstrate 5 years of physical presence. So starting from 2012, you had to show physical presence since June 15, 2007, and you still have to show that going forward. You would be eligible for work authorization. You cannot have any serious, no felonies, no serious misdemeanors. And if you have a DUI, you're completely out of the game because DUIs are considered very serious offenses in the immigration world. So what the executive order did, because that's already been in place, it essentially expanded deferred action to not only the children that arrived here, but to parents who have children that are U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents. So these individuals also must demonstrate that they've been in the United States for at least 5 years. They had to have had a child as the date of the announcement. So the executive order was announced on November 20th, 2014. So anyone who gave birth to a child on November 21st would not be eligible, assuming they had no other children. They have to pass the background check. They have to pay the application fees. So this will basically open up the doors for many people. But for many people, it won't benefit them at all. If they don't have children, or let's say they haven't been here for the 5 years, they're not going to benefit from this program. The other thing is that it expanded the work authorization. Currently, the Deferred Action Program gives work authorization for 2 years. Under the executive order, it will expand for 3 years. And this is kind of one of the problems that the government now has, that the court is going after them because they began issuing the 3-year work authorization. So they essentially started implementing the executive order despite the injunction being in place. So that will be a benefit. And then the other change that was made for the dreamers, for the young adults, is that they now only need to show physical presence from January 1st, 2010. So it gave 3 additional years, and it removed the cap in terms of you needing to be under 31. Now there's no cap. It's like however old you are, so long as you entered the United States before the age of 16, have been here since January 1st, 2010, you would be eligible to apply. Okay, in terms of impact on employers and probably local community, like I said, we're going to see increased enforcement on immigration laws in general. I think there's going to be increased budget at the federal level and at the local level for enforcement, for inspection, and for the actual law enforcement officers and officials. We'll see some changes for the high-skilled immigrants, students, and entrepreneurs. Obviously, we're going to see an increased number of individuals with work authorization. That's going to create, and we're already anticipating, we're already hearing of individuals who come forward in terms of how employers are going to handle the situation in terms of you've got, you know, Joe Smith, and the next day he comes, well, I'm not Joe Smith, I'm actually, you know, Mark Jones, and now I've got a new identity, I've got new Social Security, and what the implications of that in terms of, and here in the state of California, there was a law that was passed last year that prohibits an individual, or a business, I should say, from terminating an individual for correcting their identity or immigration status or Social Security number, so they cannot be terminated. Maintenance of I-9 forms will be very important because we anticipate seeing additional enforcement in that area and audits being conducted. And that's even in the area of EVerify. So employers who use EVerify, which if you're not familiar with, it's like a federal database that employers can put in information about their employees, and it kind of spits back out sometimes accurate, sometimes inaccurate information as to whether that individual is authorized to work in the United States. I think we're going to see a lot of red flags as these identity issues come up, and I think it's going to potentially trigger the government to look at certain industries more closely and specific employers more closely. So we anticipate a lot of close monitoring of your agriculture fields, hotel, and service industries, janitorial, restaurants, those types of industries. I'm not going to go into these kinds of details. Employers need to be careful to avoid discrimination. I won't go into that. We won't go into details about the I-9s. So again, in terms of, you know, timeframes, some of these provisions have already begun to be implemented. Others we don't have timelines for yet. And with this injunction, a lot of the provisions as it pertains to the deferred action component have been placed on hold. Okay, here's just some resources. If you're actually interested in reading the executive order completely, there's a great link there, and I'll just leave that up. Our contact information is up there, and then uscis.gov, which is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. If you have any questions about any of these, they have great FAQs, lots of really user-friendly instructions and information available as it pertains to really anything doing with immigration benefits. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass the mic. Thank you for your attention.
Well, good evening. My name's Felicity Figueroa, and if you don't mind, I'll just remain seated. I'm not a pacer. And I am here as a representative of the Friends of Orange County Detainees. This is an organization that was started in the latter half of 2012 when a group of people realized that there were a lot of immigrants in detention here in Orange County. As many of you know, Obama, in spite of all his good points, has deported more people than any administration in history. And all of those people, before they're deported, they pass through jail or prison. There are about 400,000 people who go through this system of short to long-term imprisonment every year in about 250 jails and for-profit prisons. And this costs us as taxpayers close to $5 billion a year. This is nationwide. This is nationwide. Oh. So this is paid through the Federal Bureau of Prisons to primarily for-profit prisons. There are three big groups. There's the CCA, the GEO group, and the third one is slightly smaller, MTC. And these for-profit prisons have so much power that one supposes that through their influence on Congress, Congress has now passed a law that at any given moment, 34,000 beds have to be filled with immigrants in detention throughout the United States. So coming back here to Orange County. In Orange County, we have basically three prisons where immigrants are held. Two of them are county prisons. That's the James Music Facility, which is in Irvine, and the Theo Lacey, which is a maximum security prison in Orange. There's also a city prison, Santa Ana City Jail, which is owned by the city of Santa Ana. There are about, I'd say, 1,000 immigrants in confinement in all of those, in those three venues, right, as we speak. So our organization began because we realized that many of these individuals were in confinement and they had no visitors. They are not in confinement for any kind of criminal acts. If they had any criminal acts, they paid their time, served their time before they got into deportation proceedings. These are civil charges. And as people in detention for civil charges, they have no right to an attorney, no right to any free phone calls, and phone calls can be up to $5 a minute because of the for-profit phone companies that work in these jails and for-profit prisons. And they also have no right to visitors. However, through an agreement that Friends of Orange County has with ICE, we have been allowed visitation rights into music. That was in the latter half of 2012. After that, the Santa Ana jail also allowed us to post lists within the jail so prisoners could sign up if they wanted to visit. And we're still working on Theo Lacey. We do have some people we visit there, but we don't have a formal program yet through ICE. Now, many of the people who are in confinement were picked up for the most, to us, seemingly insignificant reasons. I was visiting one person whose job was to get scrap metal and kind of go through garbage deposits and find things that could be resold. And he happened one day to see a bicycle leaning up against one of these trash bins and assumed somebody had left it there and he had no means of transportation. So he got on the bike and began to pedal away and was immediately stopped because apparently the bike belonged to somebody and he was charged with stealing private property. So after he was in, I think he only had a citation, but because he was undocumented, he was taken into custody. Now, many of these people are from an area that is very far away, sometimes even out of state. I'm currently visiting somebody whose family is in Paris, not Paris, France, but Paris, California. Not quite so far away, but still it's very difficult to come and visit your family members if you work all week, if you have children at home. If you don't have the money or transportation to get to wherever these facilities are. In some instances, the family members don't even know where their relatives are. I had one case of somebody who was actually helping, from Mexico, he was helping a cousin pass into the United States, and he got caught, and because he had had a history of run-ins with police and had actually been tortured by police in Guadalajara, he asked for asylum. So he was taken to James Music Facility. He spoke no English, and he had no way of letting his parents or his family, he had an 11-year-old daughter who had been staying with his sister in Tijuana, he had no way of letting them know where he was. So as a visitor, getting back to what we do, we are not there to advocate. We're not there to give legal advice. What we're there to do is to show them that someone on the outside cares. This is a completely humanitarian gesture. So they don't feel completely isolated and alone in these prison cells, which often are prison cells. Some are barracks, but I've been visiting someone in Theo Lacey who is, again, held in on civil charges because he doesn't want to sign a deportation order since he has 2 American-born children here and a business with employees that currently his wife is running. And he's in a 2-person cell. He is allowed to go out. It's supposed to be for 2 hours a day to a common room. He never goes outside. There's no sunlight where he is. His meals are delivered to his cell, and if he speaks up or complains, sometimes they will cut down the 2 hours to an hour and a half. And I've heard from other people, I've received letters that sometimes they only let him go out for half an hour a day or put them in a different kind. This is all obviously unofficial. So our program at Music, because my purpose here, more than anything else, is to try and get more people to visit. We have so many immigrants who would just love to have a visit, and either their family members are too far away, they don't know where they are, or they're incapable of visiting because maybe they don't have papers. And we really need more people to visit. Most of the detainees here in Orange County are from Mexico or other Central American countries. A lot of them are from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, precisely because what all of you have been hearing in the news with these terrible gang-related activities. Many of them were threatened by gangs and had to come through Mexico to wind up here in Orange County. We do have some people who have come seeking asylum. Unfortunately, even asylum seekers who have all the documentation of being tortured in the homeland. We have some from Africa, from Bangladesh, from India. They are declare that they want asylum at the border. They are also put into detention. And they often stay in detention anywhere from a few weeks or months to a few years or even longer. There was someone who was just released who had been in, this not in California, but in one of these other detention facilities. He was from Africa. He had been in detention for 9 years. So anyway, the basics of what we do. For example, if you want to go to James Music, which is a minimum security detention center in Irvine, you drive your car there, you park in the parking lot, you come in through their metal detector, you bring the name of the person you want to visit, and you are transported up about 500 meters to the visiting area, where it's a big long room like this. They have tables down the middle with a little wooden wall in the center of the table, and you sit on one side, and the visitor comes and sits on the other side, and you get to chat for half an hour. And many times people say, well, what do you talk about? There's always something to talk about. I used to live in Mexico, and I had one person I visited who was from Puebla, which is the same town that my mother-in-law is from. So we spent a lot of the time talking about chiles en nogada, about ropa vieja, all kinds of delicious food items that people in Puebla eat. I mean, these are the kind of conversations you have. They like to tell you about their kids. Sometimes they'll tell you about their job. I never would ask how it is that they happen to get into the detention center. Sometimes people want to tell you, sometimes they'd rather not. So that's music. Theo Lacey, which is the other place I visit, is a maximum security, and that's far more daunting. When you go to visit someone there, you're kept waiting a lot longer than you are usually in music. And when you are finally allowed to go through to visit your detainee, it's more like visiting someone in prison in the movies. You're in a little cubicle, you have an acrylic wall, you pick up your telephone, and you can kind of tell sometimes when they're listening to you because there's a different sound, because that's the other thing. I have the impression, and also the detainees have the impression, that in Theo Lacey, because you have these telephones, anybody can be listening. So you want to be careful what you talk about on these phones. And when your visit is over, the visits there are an hour. Visits in James Music are half an hour. The phone goes off. There's a warning, your visit is over, and the phone is cut off. The Santa Ana jail, I have never visited myself. It is a city jail, and one thing that stands out with the Santa Ana jail, it is the first jail in the nation that started a GBT pod. What that means is that in this special section of the jail, they only will have gay, bisexual, and transgender immigrants because they were being extremely mistreated in the general population. So this is really a feather in its cap for Santa Ana. It was kind of kept on the down low, but since it's been such a success, now I believe other jails throughout the nation are copying their model, and it's been wonderful for the detainees there. With James Music and Theo Lacey, you can only visit Friday, Saturday, and Sunday pretty much all day. People tend to time their visits, especially in James Music, when there are fewer families, because if you can imagine this huge room, everyone is there with their families. You're allowed to bring kids in under 5. And it gets kind of noisy, and sometimes it's hard to hear. But this is wonderful for people who do have children. It's their one opportunity to see kids. They're not allowed to touch kids. And at one point, the very first person I visited was a young woman. She was 24, same age as my older son at the time. She had 3 children who she hadn't been able to see. She had their father tell the children that she was on vacation because she was terrified that if they were to come and visit her at James Music, that one of them would try and reach over the table to touch their mom or try and go under the table or around, and that the guards would come and snatch the kids back. And she thought that would be so traumatic for her kids and for her that she'd rather her kids just thought that she was on vacation. I will leave it at that and say that in order to visit, we do ask that you come to an orientation. They will kind of go over the basic rules. There aren't really any rules. It's more letting you know that there's nothing you have to do. People might ask for money. You don't have to give any money. You're only there to provide human contact and conversation. If you want to do more, there is another group that has formed as a result of people wanting to do more, and it's called Advocates for Orange County Detainees. We have a Facebook page. We are at this point trying to gather stories of mistreatment, because we've heard a lot, especially in Theo Lacey, and maybe go to the ACLU and see if we can get some kind of action, because ICE is willing to listen to complaints. And many times it's not ICE, it's the people who work in the jails that are flexing their muscle where they shouldn't be. So I will leave it at that, since I think I've gone over. And any questions?
Music, because a
Music
jail in
is-
Irvine, I just.
Yes, it looks like a work farm. If you go all the way down Alton, where the old Families Forward used to be, where Alton and Irvine Boulevard and Irvine turns to Trabuco,
Yeah, okay.
it used to be where Alton ended. Now you can go all the way through. It's right there on Music Road, surprisingly enough. Very easy to get to.
I just wanted to congratulate you. The fact that I tried once and I couldn't stop crying. So the fact that you go in there and it's just wonderful. One small correction. You started your conversation by saying President Obama has
Deported more
deported.
people.
Now, for a minute I thought I was listening to Fox News.
It's the
But,
truth. It is.
but the fact is that he could not break the law. And that was the reason he continued to do that, because he would break the law. It was already written, so that's my information that I feel like, wait a minute, is this Fox News?
Well, just let me, just to counter that. What happens is, for example, you have ICE. I had a woman call me. I don't know how she got my phone number. She called me because her husband was in detention. The way he got into detention was because an ICE agent came to her house claiming that someone was trying to steal her husband's identity. They came with papers about somebody else, not her husband, and said, look at this, these people are trying to steal your husband's identity. We're just trying to help you. Can we come in and make sure that everything's okay? So she said, we have nothing to hide, and let them in. Once ICE agents are invited into your house, they're able to arrest you. Other people have, this happened since the injunction, and what we seem to be seeing is that they are trying to deport as many people as they can while the injunction is still in effect. Other people will go, and this is ICE. If Obama has no control over ICE,
Sure does.
then that's,
Well,
it says something about his
it
control.
also shows in the picture that we try to blame way up at the top. That, yeah, he's working on a lot of stuff, and I happen to feel that he's doing his best, but that's an issue that Fox News emphasizes and repeats it constantly, no matter when I
I
turn
would
the
have
channel.
thought Fox News,
They do.
that would be a good thing for Obama. I mean, they want people to be
No,
deported.
no, it's the other way around. But anyway, thank you and congratulations.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes. My name is Jose Moreno. Thank you for the invitation. And I'll just share a couple of thoughts of experience and contextualize a little bit of the conversation so far with the national and regional picture about immigration and what's going on. And I would love to have that conversation about Fox News and whether MSNBC helps us or Fox News or who helps us in this conversation, because it's unclear for a lot of us. But I'd like to quote somebody who talked about comprehensive immigration reform, who said, We have consistently supported a legalization program which is both generous to the alien and fair to the countless thousands of people throughout the world who seek legally to come to America. The legalization provisions in this act will go far to improve the lives of a class of individuals who now must hide in the shadows without access to many of the benefits of a free and open society. Very soon, many of these men and women will be able to step into the sunlight, and ultimately, if they choose, they may become Americans. Who do you think said that? Our man, Ronald Reagan. Right? Amazing to think where this conversation has gone in 30 plus years. Is it 30 years? About 30 years. And what we see in immigration reform and immigration policy is about every 25, 30 years or so, about every generation, there's a huge push for immigration reform. And he actually talked in his signing, Ronald Reagan did in 1986, that he began to push for it and that his administration asked Congress to put forth a comprehensive immigration reform package in 1981. And this is a Democrat Congress that he asked to do this at the time, and it took 5 years to get these provisions going. About 2.7 million folks were legalized, quote unquote legalized through that process, had their papers fixed, and I was one of them. My family came to from Mexico when I was 4 years old in 1974. And the way that many folks come to the United States is through visas, through formal visas. And my family decided to stay for medical reasons, that my mom had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and basically for her to survive, she needed to stay here to get the treatments that she needed. My dad had been here to work for a year to presumably go back to Mexico, invest in a small business, save the money, but all of those savings went into my mom's medical treatments. And then we were asked, well, she was told to stay by the doctors because while she beat cancer, it was breast cancer, they said the first 5 years that it goes into remission are critical. If it comes back more aggressive and much likelier to succumb to the disease unless it's captured early again. So my parents made the decision to stay here in the United States, and we grew up in Oxnard, California. So we were one of those 2.7 million folks in the U.S. who processed through that. 75% of folks who were eligible submitted their forms to become authorized to stay in the U.S., and about 90% of those who applied ended up getting their application approved. One of the things that was key about that bill, however, in 1986, was that it left out hundreds of thousands of families. It didn't necessarily impact families who were not eligible at the time. So years later, George Bush, Ronald Reagan, and others took executive action to formalize the status of those families, of the extended folks who were perhaps left out of the original law. So the idea of executive action being thrown out by Fox News and others that we now have an emperor here in the United States, that was already preceded by beginning in 1961 with President Kennedy, who began executive actions around refugees from Cuba. And every president since has initiated some form of executive action to formalize the status of folks who were in such desperate situations in the United States, in this limbo, that they were at the mercy of being exploited, either at home or here. They were in the shadows and were not then participating in a way that we know that they could. So what we have today is this conversation about immigration that many folks believe it's one that is new again, but it's the very same rhetoric as many of you know who lived through these kind of conversations. What's different about this one is that we do have a president who has been both the worst and now the best. It's a really difficult space for a lot of us as Democrats, for myself, I'll say as a Latino progressive Democrat, to say, wow, how do we embrace Obama, who unfortunately did. He did deport over 2 million folks. And he's the one that aggressively pursued what's called secure communities and convinced communities that immigration enforcement was about community safety, which a lot of us believe in. We do believe that if someone is a clear threat to public safety on physical violence and abuse of our community through drugs or other means, then of course we want the book to be thrown at them. That said, that program, which was supposed to target those folks, more than about 60% of the folks who were actually deported through secure communities were not folks who were a threat, immediate threat to public safety, and that's based on their own data. So folks have been pushing hard to get the administration to shift that, and they finally did, in part because of California's leadership and what we call the Trust Act here in California, which is that in California, our Attorney General, Kamala Harris, how do we say her name, Kamala? Or is it Kamala? My elementary school was Kamala Elementary. I'm not saying I'm endorsing one with it, I'm just saying it's a lot of coincidence. So Kamala said that it's a voluntary program. It's a volunteer program. We don't have to do it. The federal government made us believe that we had to participate as local communities in our cities. police departments. But her ruling was, no, it does not have to be. It's not required. It is voluntary. And as a result, different municipalities and counties began to move back from secure communities and not enforce it. Secure communities has basically meant that immigration officials come into the jails, or they train deputies or police department folks, and they could detain folks for up to 48 hours for immigration. So what we had, that's why the 2 million spikes up, is what we had here in Costa Mesa and Irvine and Santana and Anaheim is hundreds and hundreds of families who, a mom who will be driving to school, we saw this in Anaheim, mom will be driving to school, there's a tail light out on the back of the car, and she gets pulled over, gets asked for identification, doesn't have identification. So the police officer, in their due diligence, can't just let someone go, because you want to make sure it's not someone who is a threat to public safety. They may have a warrant, who knows who they are. So they bring them into the police department, and they get processed. In getting processed, a red flag goes up because they don't have papers. So then they hold them for immigration officials. And now this mom, because she had a bad taillight, is now in Adelanto Detention Center. And her kids have no idea where she is. Her husband has no idea where she is. So that's the kind of experience that we're talking about at a very local level, qualitatively, of what happened when the administration and Congress and a lot of folks over the last couple decades just did not really formulate immigration law in a way that would capture the humanity of who we want to be, who we say we want to be. As a result, there's a lot of terror in communities, as we know. In fact, there's a book written about Costa Mesa by a lecturer from Cal State Long Beach named Humberto Caspa, who used to write an article, a column here in the local paper. And he called it Terrorism in the Latino Barrios of Costa Mesa. Because just imagine, this was my experience growing up as a child, as an undocumented child, is you just don't know. When you go for work, when you go to work as a parent, you don't know if you're going to see your spouse again when you come home. You don't know if you're going to ever see your children again. You just don't know. So it's every single day that you go out into the public square, you just don't know what's going to happen. And that's the kind of terror that a lot of us are trying to convince our elected officials to really understand, and our community leaders to understand. However you feel about immigration, there's something happening locally that none of us would want to be under the umbrella of, which is this current immigration system. And while everybody says they want it fixed, we see nothing happening. In Los Amigos of Orange County, which is a community group that I work with, we countless number of folks who come to our meetings in the morning basically seeking advice because their husband or their wife or their son has been detained by immigration officials. And then we'll call folks like Lisa and say, Lisa, could you help us out? Because Lisa is one of the attorneys in the community who said, if there's someone who's in desperate need of immediate representation, I'm happy to help. But then we also strain on them because they have to make a living too. And so as a result, our community then gets desperate for trying to figure out what to do, and that's when folks begin to get papers, fraudulent papers, because they get so desperate. And we create that condition. We create that condition. So what I'd like to the message I'd like to leave with you with is that there's a lot of myths about who immigrants are, and a lot of myths about who has enacted immigration policy and whether it's a party issue or not. Clearly, the Republican Party is quite an obstructionist party at this moment in time, but certainly Democrats need to be a little bit more aggressive. Is what I would say. We need to be more aggressive and push this harder. That's where Obama now is finally saying, okay, we're going to go ahead and do this. It's the last year and a half of his presidency, so hopefully in this upcoming presidential election, this becomes an issue that folks will stand behind. He did it in 2007, but in 2008, he postponed it for 2 years, and then he postponed it for another year, and then we got DACA, and now it's in the last year. So I hope that we locally can push our local electeds and our regional electeds, our state electeds, and others to push this issue as hard as we can because of the human condition. And a lot of folks think, well, we can't do anything because of Congress. Well, we could do things at a very local level. Local cities have asked their police departments not to participate in federal programs of putting immigration officials in their jails. That's a local decision. Local cities can participate in immigrant integration programs to bring people out of the shadows and say, we're not going to participate in other programs about enforcement that specifically target specific communities that are not a threat to public safety, and let's focus our resources on public safety. And then lastly, people believe that immigration reform is about people who just arrived a week ago. If we do immigration reform, they're going to all come to the border. And in fact, what the data shows is that 2/3, 2 out of 3 immigrants in the U.S. right now arrived more than 15 years ago. That is 2 out of 3 have already set their lives here. They've set up their livelihood. They're Americans for all intents and purposes. Here in Orange County, almost 1 out of 5 kids in Orange County has an undocumented parent. Think about that. 1 out of 5 kids in Orange County has an undocumented parent. in our local probation department. 3 years ago, a study was done by the UCI Community Labor Project, which put out a Cusp of Change report. I really urge you to take a look at it. Just Google UCI Community Labor Project, Cusp of Change report, and they document here how just two and a half years ago in the state of California, of all juveniles who were turned over to immigration officials in the state of California, because if you're juvenile and undocumented, immigration officials, you actually get turned over to them. 43% of those juveniles were in Orange County. That is, our probation department made up almost half of all juveniles turned over to immigration officials. That's a local decision process that we can make. Because of this report, because other youth really engaged the issue, and attorneys and community people, the probation department now has changed its policy. Changed its policy. It was very embarrassing to them. But when we don't watch, when we don't raise our voice, they're just going to do whatever they can to get away with it. So I'll leave you with that for a conversation and a back and forth, and hopefully a way that we can figure out how we get Costa Mesa to enact some local municipal codes that protect people and not criminalize them.
I was just going to add 2 comments after listening to both the speakers. One is, I honestly believe Obama's interest in trying to be a strong enforcer was to appease the Republicans and thinking that he was going to get them to the table when it came to legalization. And I think what he unfortunately learned the hard way was that his efforts to really be, tough on enforcement resulted in tough on enforcement, and that was it. So that's my personal opinion. The other thing that I want, because I just, we're in Costa Mesa, and you mentioned about local policies and secured communities. I don't know if this has changed because I haven't had a specific case in Costa Mesa recently, but this is one specific practical thing any one of you can kind of look into or take away from, because I think it's an important local policy decision that could use some change. One of the things that I did, and again, because I think I'm just community at heart, and despite the fact that I'm not a nonprofit in terms of my business, but we saw the U visa is a visa that is specifically designed to support law enforcement in its investigation and prosecution of crimes where there's high number of undocumented immigrants in a particular community. And so basically what it does is, for individuals who have been victims of violent crimes, and they report the crime to law enforcement, and they're cooperative in the investigation and the prosecution of the crime, with the certification of a law enforcement agent, officer, the designated certifying official for that agency, they can attain a U visa, which is temporary legal status for a period of 4 years and a pathway to potentially get lawful permanent residency. This is huge because before the U visa existed, these communities would never call the police because they were afraid by calling the police, they would be calling immigration to their door. So the U visa has really been an invaluable tool to law enforcement in terms of getting the cooperation so that they can go after the criminals, those that are just wreaking havoc on these communities. So what we found here in Orange County was a lot of law enforcement agencies, when the regulations finally got released, were reluctant to even participate in signing these certifications. It became such a big concern that I basically coordinated a training with the help of Orange County Human Relations Commissions, which I couldn't ever have pulled this off without them, and the Irvine Police Chief, who is the head of the Police Chiefs Association of California, the year that we decided to do that. So again, it was just the perfect timing of and willingness of these other partners to come together. So I coordinated a training for all of the local law enforcement agencies, both county and cities, for Orange County, so that law enforcement agencies could understand what the U visa is, what their role is in the process, because some of them were like, well, I don't think this person deserves it. And it's like, well, that isn't your decision. Let's let USCIS determine whether they're eligible. Like, what you're only certifying is, were they helpful in the investigation or the prosecution of the crime? Now, Costa Mesa, and this is what I'm curious to know if anything has changed, unfortunately was one of the very few jurisdictions that basically their policy was not to sign. So we would have victims of severely violent crimes in this community, and unfortunately I said, if this happened in Santa Ana, if it happened in Anaheim, there's something we can do. But unfortunately, because it was Costa Mesa, the policy of the department is not to sign. Like, that is the policy. It's not even like we'll evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. So I don't know if that's changed in recent times, but I think it's something, if it hasn't changed, could be very valuable advocacy if you really want to make a difference, because it's kind of, it's ironic, because this is really a tool to help law enforcement agencies, people, as its words come out, they know about, they're trying to cooperate, and then they're really kind of, not able to benefit from what the federal law has allowed them to pursue. So that's just one thing I'll throw out there. But again, I don't know what the latest is on that, but it's a local relevant issue.
To advocate for that, would you say write a letter to the city council or to the police, or what's
Well,
so good? How about if I wanted to write a letter to get something changed?
City council, because it's coming
I
from
mean,
there.
city council is ultimately the one that's responsible for the
So
police
just
chief
like
and the agent. I mean,
the members and then just email them.
For whatever it's worth, it's an almost explicit goal of the Costa Mesa City Council to de-Latinize
Right.
Costa Mesa, because they want to turn West Costa Mesa into a development area. They think, why can't we be Huntington Beach or Newport Beach? Let's get them out of here.
Well, even Huntington Beach, though, will sign the certification. So, yeah, I mean, but I have to say, I mean, going back 10, 15 years, Costa Mesa's come along. I have lots of stories about Costa Mesa and the challenges that we faced with regards to immigration. And not to say it's perfect, but it's come a long way.
Oh, I have a comment. I just want to say that one of the cases that we were very intimately involved with happened in Costa Mesa. I'd forgotten it was in Costa Mesa, just over here by Mesa Verde in that area. That there's a family who has been very involved in immigration reform. Some of their members worked for OCO, which is the Orange County Congregation Community Organization, which does a lot of work for immigration reform. The oldest brother, the two of the kids, who are 20 and 22, have DACA. But the older one, who is 23, they all came here when they were 2, 3, and I think 5 years old. He had had a DUI. I believe he was sitting in his car after he'd been drinking, and the police gave him a DUI for sitting. The car was not moving at the time. But he was not able to get DACA. So last year, at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on the door, and they said, we're looking for these people. And they had pictures of other people with other names. And they said, we'd like all adult members of the household to come outside. And people thought there was nothing wrong. They all came outside, and they took this one fellow over to their car and promptly arrested him and took him away to the Santa Ana jail. However, this one particular family is very well connected within the community, and especially the activist community. They called a press conference. They called members of OCO. They called a lot of congregations. A lot of pastors showed up, OCO people, media. That by 1 o'clock, he was back with the family. So you see, these are things, they don't want a bad reputation. They are able to release people. They're just trying to see, however, if they can get as many people as they can by these devious methods.
You talked before that there was somebody who's been detained for 9 years. What's the average and how is that determined? Is it court cases that are dragging on? I mean,
Well, just going to say one thing, that we had a talk by a new professor in the law school. Is very interesting, about, she did a statistical study about people who ask for bonds. People are able to, after 6 months, there was a new law, I'm not that,
The Rodriguez bond hearing.
the Rodriguez bond hearing, and they need to have a hearing to see if they can get out on bond. This professor did a statistical survey of people who had reasonable bonds, 1,500, maybe 3,000, and people who had unreasonable bonds, like $90,000, which is the fellow that I'm visiting in Theo Lacey right now, for the same kind of misdemeanor that got them picked up in the first place. And after she did this survey, she determined that there were 2 factors that determined if you were going to get a reasonable bond or really high bond. Number 1, if you had a lawyer with you. Number 2, which immigration judge you happened to see. With Judge E, the bonds were down here. With Judge B, the bonds were up here. Consistently. regardless of where the person was from, how long they've been in the States, how many family ties they had to their community, and what their original misdemeanor that got them picked up in the first place was. So it is an incredibly arbitrary system.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as a practical matter, I mean, I joke, although it's not funny, that some of my removal cases last longer than most marriages because just the courts are so inundated. Any arriving alien who's seeking asylum is not eligible for bond right off the bat. So they have to stay for at least 6 months. And then there's factors that need to be evaluated. They're rarely, if ever, released on their own recognizance, so they have to come up, and the minimum bond is $1,500. Most of these people don't have a dime to their name. And then to be able to show that they've got community ties and they're not a national security threat. And if they're from certain countries that may have, civil strife, and judges are, they're administrative judges, they're political appointees. Some of them are really fearful. They don't want their, person to be released on bond or whatever, and then they go do some terrorist activity, and so people from certain countries, I hate to say it, but there's prejudice and discrimination within our justice system, are precluded from being released. So, and then if they ultimately, and I would imagine probably with this case is, if they ultimately lose their case and they decide to appeal, I mean, then we're talking additional years, and they can't be released, during that time. So there's a number of factors, I think, that figure. But I think if you have legal representation, but that takes a lot to have because there really just aren't a lot of nonprofits. There's not a lot of funding for immigration legal representation. So that's kind of what results. Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned the DACA program and also the executive order. The Special Immigrant Juvenile Status Program, which is really significant, seems to be something that people don't know much about. I'm an attorney at the Court of Appeal, and I've seen a lot of writs where people apply too late for it, or judges do not understand how it works. And it seems that you might want to explain to people what that program is, and the two-step, the state procedure in terms of getting guardianship, and then the federal procedure. But it seems that the community needs to be informed, and judges need to be informed. And I wonder if anyone's working on that.
Yeah. So the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status is for individuals who, and children, really, they're juveniles, so they're under 18, who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected. And so some of them may have had their biological parents here in the U.S., but have been physically removed from the home as a result of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. And so they have to go through this process to become wards of the court. So there is a state process that needs to be followed, and only if and when that is accomplished. And then I think right now, because we used to have a big issue with this in Orange County, but my understanding is that all of those that are in the county foster care system are being handled by, I don't know if it's county counsel's office, but there's 2 individuals within the courts that are responsible for starting that process. How many are actually slipping through the cracks, I don't know. So the only cases that I see anymore, and I just did one very, very recently, is those who have a legal guardian that is not.
That's the kind of case that I've seen.
Okay, that's what's happening.
And where people don't know they need to get that guardianship established.
And I had
And
one.
Central Americans.
He was turning 18 on December 26th, and I think they came to us on December 23rd, and I can tell you where I spent my Christmas Eve because it was that important, for this kid, because through no fault of his own, to get this to just filed before he turned 18, because once he turns 18, he loses any opportunity.
Was he in the foster system?
So no, he had a legal guardian that was a neighbor. So the neighbor basically took all 3 kids, because they saw the abuse and abandonment, and they were very involved because they were neighbors. I guess they knew the kids, and so they agreed to take all 3. 2 of them were U.S. citizens. It was just the oldest that was actually a Mexican national. So it wasn't until they kind of by a fluke learned of this program that they realized that they had gone through the process, and in fact, one of the husband is the attorney, and he tried to do it himself, and he went through, because we don't handle that side in terms of the guardianship. I'm not familiar with, because typically you need a family law attorney to handle that. So, but he went through, I can't even tell you how many hoops to be able to just get that in terms of the order, the judge's order, so that we could apply for the next step. But he didn't realize that it needed to be done before he
Right.
turned 18.
Just to clarify for people, the reason this became a big deal is that wave of Central American refugees. The kids who came up, they were 14, 15, 16 years old, and they came up here as unaccompanied minors. And so then they could find relatives to stay with or neighbors,
Right.
but they never got an official guardianship in place. So then they couldn't take advantage of this program.
So now it's interesting because actually there's going to be a big conference call or teleconference on the specific topic for the Honduran, Guatemalan, the Salvadoran kids to really make the community aware of this program. So I know USCIS is really trying to educate the community in what this is and who's eligible and how to apply, et cetera. But that doesn't take the burden off in terms of who's going to get the guardianship, in terms of going through that state process. And each state has its own, process. But one thing I'll just point out is that the government does not discriminate against age. So, I mean, the youngest child that I've represented was 6 years old. So even those that are unaccompanied minors that come here by themselves, they're placed in removal proceedings just like any adult. Now, thankfully, there's organizations like KIND, which provides legal representation because it's a nonprofit organization for these children, and a lot of them, pro bono attorneys volunteering their time to represent these kids. But before that, I mean, they were really treated just like an adult would, and it was just horrific. And there was one judge, Judge Munoz in LA, that was responsible for that
That's
docket.
Judge D, by the way. I wasn't gonna mention any names, but you mentioned them.
She said it.
Before,
Go ahead.
Thank you. If a person asks a question, are they limited to many questions?
No,
or-
you can ask as many questions as you'd like.
Oh, okay, thank you. I guess as a preamble, I have certain questions, and I was told by a friend, be careful because you may be like retaliated against or misunderstood, which hopefully is not the case. But I maybe have a different view to the overall picture of this. And you mentioned about a quote from Ronald Reagan with the immigration policy in 1986. And that particular policy or law that was passed was supposed to be a one-time only. And the numbers that they cited was 3 million, but actually like 6 million people actually were able to utilize that particular law. Now, with that being said, current times, enforcement issues were always stated, but they were never enforced. And that's how we're reason we're here today. And I just had a couple of questions I would like to ask with that preface. One, I was curious, when did, in a sense of becoming a United States citizen from another country, naturalized, that you can now be a dual citizen? When did that change?
That depends on the country.
Yes.
I'm talking here.
There's no dual citizenship
Except for
recognized
Israel.
by the United States.
So, although people have stated that, for example, they're citizens of England and of the United States, they're mistaken.
No, it's because England will will allow them to retain their British citizenship, not because the U.S. recognizes or permits. If I only have U.S. citizenship, if I became a citizen, so the U.S. would not permit me to have a second citizenship. But other countries, and again, there's this entire, you can look at every country's rules in terms of who would allow, it's the foreign country that permits the dual citizenship. It's not the United States that permits it.
For example, I was born in England, but I was brought here as a baby, and I have dual citizenship, although I never used my British citizenship. One of my children was born in Mexico. He has dual citizenship, and the other one was born here. We registered him at the Mexican embassy. He has dual citizenship. My husband was born in Mexico, Mexican national. When we first moved here, he did not want to give up his Mexican citizenship because at that time Mexico did not recognize dual citizenship, and he would have had to give up his Mexican citizenship in order to acquire the American citizenship. However, about 15 years ago, Mexico changed its policy. It now does allow dual citizenship, so at that point my husband decided to become a U.S. citizen.
So the U.S. does not allow U.S.-born citizens to have dual citizenship in other countries?
They don't stop you.
Right, because my
They won't
second son
recognize it.
was born here, but he has Mexican citizenship from Mexico's point of view because he has a Mexican father.
But there used to be a policy where if you chose to become a United States citizen, that you had to give up your previous citizenship from whatever country you're from, and that was the policy of law in the United States.
I
So
believe at
there's-
18, don't you have to declare allegiance to?
I was gonna say,
Right,
as a
at
part of
18.
the oath and as a part of the requirements of obtaining US citizenship, in terms of who you're gonna bear arms for, your allegiance,
Yeah.
you have to commit or pledge that allegiance to the United States.
I
So
know,
there
but-
is a written
But so you
commitment.
give up your other citizenship from the other country?
You don't give up the citizenship, but if your other country and US would be at war, you're committing that you would basically, your allegiance, and you would bear arms for the United States.
Okay, but you still have dual citizenship or more?
In
So
effect.
the first part of your question is a really critical one about some of the contradictions about folks who push for broader enforcement and federal funding for enforcement. Upon the enactment of the law, it was the first of its kind that provided employer sanctions, right? IRCA, 1986. That part of the law was not ever fully funded, but also what happened is because of the I-9, according to the Policy Migration Institute who did an analysis, they found that what businesses began to do is began to contract out through human resources. That's when you saw an explosion of human resources subcontracting to verify the papers. So the business was never liable in determining whether folks are truly undocumented or not. So that's what ended up allowing a lot of fraudulent papers to come through, and that's one of the things what they say that the enforcement piece didn't quite work. At that time, border enforcement, the budget for it was about $700 million. Today it's $18 billion. And that's where the contradiction is of Republicans, right? Is they say you just can't keep throwing money at a problem. The money is not the solution. They say that when we talk about public education. But when it comes to border enforcement, they keep throwing the same money at the same issue. We don't see it. Part of this is a bigger macro issue about business, of course, but also about our foreign trade policies. So we also saw that this immigration issue became huge in terms of its impact in Latin America after NAFTA, where because of multinational corporations, the way the economies played out, transnational economies, a lot of folks, small-time farmers in rural areas of Mexico, as well as Central America, South, began to basically migrate north to northern cities of Mexico. Where you see a huge influx of population of the borderlands, where we see the maquiladoras, which are companies that are set up right on this side of the border. So we're about to see that again. Our current president is pushing for this transatlantic, what is it, the TAP? No, the Trans-Pacific one. Yeah, so there's just this huge love affair with these trade agreements, but have no protections for workers in the targeted country or for workers here. So one of the things is that we don't see the boomerang effect for a couple of years, maybe a decade, and we'll see that again from Asia. We're seeing it now Central America. That's where the kids are coming from, as well as our deportation process. And then lastly, one of the things about citizenship that's critical is that Lou Correa passed a resolution, put forth a resolution in California, where he noted formally that there are at least 500,000 U.S. citizen children in Mexico as a function of this administration's deportation policies. So there's citizen kids who have basically been exiled to Mexico, my language, because their parents were either deported or under deportation orders, and they left to Mexico. The Mexican government in multiple states is struggling with what to do with the children because they're 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. They don't speak Spanish because our education system told them, get rid of your Spanish so you can do well here in school. So their parents didn't necessarily teach them the language. So they're struggling in schools in Mexico to figure out what do we do with these kids. And they're also struggling with immigration in Mexico because they're not citizens. So they have to go through a new process to get the double citizenship, the dual citizenship. So it's just a huge, huge mess that when you look at the core of who we are or who we want to be is we're literally just like the 1930s, just like the 1950s, and now is we're literally deporting U.S. citizen children for all intents and purposes. And that's the part that just, I don't understand the Republican wing of this. I don't understand any wing of this that says, let's fix it just for that purpose at the very least.
So you talked a little bit about the churn in communities. To what extent has the California law regarding driver's licenses alleviated any of that, or is that just really a Band-Aid? It seems like that's at least like a starting point for some sort of, being able to produce that identification when you get pulled over for a tail light.
The one thing everybody realizes that there's an annotation on the driver's license that says, I mean, it doesn't say it, but it indicates that this person is not a U.S. citizen. So as soon as a policeman sees it, they know that it isn't serving as a proof of citizenship.
Yeah, I mean, it's still noted, and depending on the local police agency, whether they choose to, although the law itself does say that it cannot be used against you per se, but we see that with police agencies across the country, that once they have some probable cause, they will exercise it depending on the nature and the politics of that particular county. So that's the big fear for a lot of us. Has it alleviated? I don't know. All I know is that there's a picture that I showed in different presentations of the Orange County Register's front page a week after the bill was, the license, DMV began to distribute licenses, and it's an older Anglo man in the middle waiting in line at DMV, surrounded by a bunch of brown people, and it basically says, like, the lines at DMV couldn't get any worse. Undocumented people now get their license. So it's just really kind of this very symbolic, racialized way of thinking about, you mentioned de-Latinizing, this racialized way of looking at laws or policies that are just really looking to be inclusive and to protect people regardless of their status. You want to protect their humanity, and so the Register has just jumped in on that. I would like to also make a plea to all of you, if you, while we may not like the Register very much, at the end of the day, there is a conversation going on there that keeps feeding these myths. So to the extent that we can write letters to the editor or op-ed pieces ourselves would be immensely helpful to folks, because when you just see a little letter to the editor in Orange County that says, leave them alone, they're human beings, it really reverberates throughout a community, because folks feel like, okay, it's the orange curtain, yes, but there's a lot of good people who are trying to do the right thing in this county.
I was just going to say, I was never a fan of Jose knows, because we had email exchanges going on with the driver's license. It is a valid form of identity. It can't be used for federal purposes, but I don't think there's any law that could possibly be passed to curtail abuse where abuse is going to happen. So with or without the license, we still find instances of abuse at the DMV through law enforcement. It's just there, and I don't know that you can really change hearts through laws. So.
I think Eleanor's had her hand up for a little while ago.
Yeah, it seems obvious that a whole lot of reform, immigration reform, is needed. But given the makeup of the Congress and the many Republican governors, my concern is that immigration reform is going to be used as one more tool to break labor unions. Is there anything we can do about that? And I'm not speaking so much as, we as individuals, okay, we have no control over that. But is there anything that communities can do?
I personally don't think immigration reform is going to happen without labor unions. So in terms of organizers, I mean, honestly, my comment before about President Obama, being hard on enforcement and then coming around when he realized that he wasn't getting anywhere, with that tactic. It was really, in my opinion, the courage and bravery of the young adults that really, pushed for DACA, for the deferred action for childhood arrivals. So the Dreamers, as not just the Dreamers, but what I see, there is such an interest of, every day I probably get an email of somebody who wants to pursue immigration law. And because they have been personally firsthand touched by generally a negative experience in their family, so they're moved to want to do something and to contribute something. So I honestly think the Republicans for not much longer are going to be able to ignore the reality, because it's really going to surge from the ground up. And so labor, I think, is going to be a part of that. I also think just organized community groups here locally, whether it's OCO or Acorn, all of these efforts are really going to be, and so I think in those efforts, they're sophisticated and savvy enough to protect themselves. I don't know, Jose, what you think. I'm not concerned about labor going away as a result of immigration.
Labor's come in really, really strong on this issue, and the Orange County Labor Federation has started an immigrant worker center, so that even if you're not part of a labor union per se, but your rights as a worker have been violated. A lot of issues in immigrant communities, besides actual abuse, physical and otherwise, there's also what's called wage theft, which is you don't get paid your overtime, you don't get paid for hours that you work, and it's very difficult to complain about it, because even though the law is supposed to protect you, as Lisa said, it doesn't always get enforced in a positive way. So the Orange County Labor Federation has been very active. In fact, that's why half the report is about this issue. The AFL-CIO, the National AFL-CIO, the executive vice president is Tafari Gabre, who was the executive director of the Orange County Labor Federation, and part of his ascendancy and the request of Richard Trumka, asking him to run with him to become the executive vice president, was because of the work around immigration, community partnerships, and labor here in Orange County. So ironically, Orange County is kind of a model for this exact question of that we should always look for working with working people about their rights, because regardless whether you're union or not, you have rights. And the labor movement has been very strong with that.
If I might, within that, I'm very involved in the International Franchise Association, which is about as right as you can get. And yet, when it comes to comprehensive immigration reform, they're very much behind it. You can get small businesses because there is such a degree of reliance now on our immigrant population in fast food. They would be lost if a lot of people went back. So I think at a local level, if we can start through the Chamber of Commerce to get some of the businesses involved, it is to their best interest to push for reform, because they will lose their labor force.
And they are involved. I mean, on a national level, the Chamber of Commerce, I mean, business seems to be, maybe not across the board, but pretty consistently supportive, because they're really where the rubber hits the road, so they really get, like, you know, Congress sometimes operates up here and they create policies that don't necessarily play out maybe how they think they might. But certainly with businesses, I mean, they're the ones that are feeling the lack of you know, labor pool qualified workers, or the workers that they need to perform the jobs that they have. So yeah, the more that businesses can organize, certainly.
Yeah, but they tend to organize against unions, against organized labor.
They organize in their own interest.
Yeah, well, as they perceive it. And so there have been many times, like with the drywallers, a lot of immigrant drywallers came in and broke the union. And, you know, that's the kind of thing I fear.
And I think that's the lesson learned. The lesson learned is, regardless if an immigration reform comes from the labor side, is that the labor is here. So working to organize immigrant labor as much as you do any other labor force has become a really good learned lesson from the parts of labor. Trumka came out again today pushing for immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship, which is the big one for a lot of us.
Excuse me. Two things. When you mention about employment, and she mentioned an example, drywall, for example, other employment. Example, in New York City, you know, this example, in certain neighborhoods, let's say ones that are African-American dominate neighborhoods, that 50% of the black males are unemployed. Now, I'm just saying that I think there's a pool of people already here, you know, various backgrounds, who could fill many jobs. And sometimes employers wish to, for immigrants, I'm using quotation because the games are being played, because they sometimes take advantage of these people, immigrants, and the way they treat them labor-wise, you know. So there may be a self-interest, not so-called altruistic reasons, you know. And also, too, that Cesar Chavez, you know, United Farm Workers person, if people don't know, but
Today's the
yeah. He himself was against illegal or undocumented immigration, because he knew that would hurt the farm labor unions, and the farm owners were doing that to break up the unions. So I just wanted to state that. Thank you.
One other point too, just to put on top of this, which is very interesting. When we went through the whole charter discussion here in Costa Mesa, prevailing wage was originally implemented by Republican Congress members who wanted to prevent immigration from taking over labor in certain cities. And they wanted to have a prevailing wage law so that people would get an equal wage. And it was to help maintain certain levels of employment in those cities. Now, how that then got flipped around as a way to, you know, in the way it is today, of course, is interesting just from an evolutionary point of view. but a lot of, you know, the idea of creating good working conditions goes across all nationality barriers, and in fact would help improve the workers' level, including, you know, immigrants who come into the country to not take advantage, and citizens who live here already who want to have good paying jobs. So anyhow.
So we've got time for one more question.
Let me just make one comment, because I want to be very clear that if there's an employer that's actually petitioning for a worker, they have the prevailing wage requirements that they have to meet. They have to post the job. They have to do a whole recruiting effort and demonstrate to the government that there's no qualified workers who are able to perform the job that they need performed. So, yeah, so.
H-1B visa problems, people have done research, and there's been an article, a story about, although in theory that's supposed to be practiced, in actuality it's not.
There's fraud, I will say, probably in every aspect of life. So I'm not saying that it's a perfect system, but it's still those that choose to play by the rules, it's still a process and the requirements have to be met. And in our experience, in our work, that process is met. I mean, we wouldn't do it otherwise. But and the other comment I'll just throw out that we haven't talked about yet, because we're talking about enforcement in borders and undocumented people. 30% of the people who are here in the United States in undocumented status actually came in legally, and they simply overstayed their visas. So we can't forget. So it's not necessarily always an issue of we got to, you know, build bare fences. We got to, you know, because those are just our neighbors to the south. We don't have those fences to the neighbors to the north. In fact, they can come and go as they please. So just to kind of be mindful that when we talk about undocumented immigrants, it's not just people from Latin America coming across, you know, sneaking across, whatever. 30% are those from all over the world who come to visit or on a temporary visa and overstay, or students.
I just,
The Economic Policy Institute did an analysis on that point, and they found that where immigration enforcement became more intense, and as a result, workers left. And this is happening in the South in particular. Other workers did not come in and take the jobs. Instead, crops went unpicked, and Alabama is a great case study of this. They did a law similar to Prop 187 here some years ago, and Stephen Colbert did a big thing about it. And they lost over $2 billion in crops because they couldn't get workers who were citizens and or legal residents to come and do the work for the wages they were willing to pay, which is minimum wage. No, right, but my point is that through that analysis that was done by the Economic Policy Institute, they found that where you do see greater enforcement, the presumption is that there's other workers ready to take the jobs. The fact is these are jobs that folks don't want to do because they just don't pay enough for whatever reasons, right? It doesn't suggest anything about the worker, it suggests about the economy itself that they find themselves
We have guest worker programs for that. And also, what about for people in work in urban environments? Have there been studies compared when
Yes.
they were enforced that there weren't jobs filling for in urban environments?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'd like to see those.
Yeah, it's the Economic Policy Institute. They do a lot of good work on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna wrap it up.
can I just say one more thing? In the community, there are many people who could be citizens. There are 100,000 people in Orange County who could become citizens, but because of the cost or because of the paperwork or because of their language skills, they are not able or think they aren't able to continue the process and become citizens. And all of you probably, without even knowing that you know somebody, probably do know somebody who could become a citizen. And that is one way to make Costa Mesa become more of the kind of community that we'd love to see it become. More citizens, informed citizens, new citizens, immigrant citizens, the better.
Democrat citizens.
Yeah.